I just want to say welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here for Whistleblowing, especially after, this is the second day of the conference and it's post-lunch. We've lost some members due to flights, but it's lovely to see this full room. And really, thank you for being here. And I think it's going to be a very interesting session. When we looked at the title, Protected and Encouraged Whistleblowing, what needs to be done? I was reflecting on this when I was looking at the rest of the program, and it occurred to me that of all the topics that we are discussing over these 2 days, I absolutely believe that, boiled down to what it is, corruption is a life and death issue in this country, but no more so is it so acutely a life and death issue as it relates to whistleblowing. And unfortunately, we have seen that played out in reality time and time again. In addition to other kind of detriments that whistleblowers tend to suffer generally in South Africa simply for stepping up and doing the right thing. So when we talk about protected whistleblowing, absolutely, this is 100% something that we need. But then we also go to the flip side, which is encouraged whistleblowing. And that is really the power of whistleblowing. There's a lot that is, difficult and sad, really, when you think about whistleblowing. But you also think of this great gift that people who blow the whistle give to their country for some kind of, underlying sense of right and wrong, public service. So really, we want to encourage, to not kind of make whistleblowing something that is its own thing that, only a select few on a pedestal can do. It's something that all of us can do. But in order to do that, we need to have laws in place, systems in place, and a whole host of kind of support and protection and encouragement interventions in order to make this a reality. So that is what we're going to be exploring today with our esteemed panelists. So I'll begin with Jeff, who is here with us in person. Jeff Wicks is an investigative journalist at News 24 and the joint winner of the 2021 and 2023 Taco Caper Award for Investigative Journalism. Well done, Jeff. He is the co-author of 8 Days in July, Inside the Zuma Unrest That Set South Africa Alight. And then online we have Rehana Kassim. Professor Rehana Kassim, I apologize, is the professor in the Mercantile Law Department of UNISA. She is the author and co-author of 5 scholarly books on company law and an NRF-rated researcher. Her research interests are company law and corporate governance, and her research has focused particularly on the accountability of boards of directors, delinquent directors, and whistleblowing. So we're very fortunate to have our 2 panelists here today to kick off this interesting and hopefully enlightening panel. Jeff, I'm going to give you 15 minutes to start, and then we'll move to Rehana.
Perfect. Thank you so much. It's heartening to know that I'm the only non-professor on the panel, so I'll do my best to hold the room as a lay journalist. So I think, Prof, as you alluded to, you're not a prof. There's too many profs. So, as you alluded to in your introduction, I mean, it's trite by this point to drive home the point of how important whistleblowers are in our current society and in the current status quo the country finds itself in. And I'm here to talk to you today about a story that's particularly close to me. It's the most challenging story I've ever undertaken in my career, and it's an investigation that continues today. A lot of you have heard me speak before, so I apologize if there's repetition. That's especially for you, Nishan. You've heard this many times, but I'll try to put a twist in the tail for you. Whistleblowing is such an important facet of our democracy, and it's grown to be such an important facet of our democracy, but I'd like to just narrate a visceral case study of a whistleblower, something we've written a lot about and something we continue to write about, and that's Babita Deokaran and her sacrifice. So Babita Deokaran was a career civil servant, and at the time that she was assassinated, she was the chief director of financial accounting at the Gauteng Department of Health. She was assassinated on the 23rd of August 2021 when gunmen pulled up alongside her vehicle and peppered the car with bullets. She was shot 12 times and she died later in hospital. What we didn't know at the time was the disclosure that she'd made. And her case is an example of a whistleblower, I would contend, even though it's a contested title. But she's someone who stood up against obvious corruption and then paid the price for it. So she was, at the time of her death, 53 years old. She was a single mother to a teenage daughter, and she obviously occupied a quite high-level post at the Gauteng Department of Health. And in that post, she had a macro view of spending and procurement across many arms of that state facility. She was someone who had always been in the civil service. She'd climbed the ranks at the Gauteng Department of Health, and she was also someone who wasn't unfamiliar with persecution. So you would remember the scandalous COVID-19, or one example of scandalous COVID-19 procurement in the height of the pandemic was when companies linked to the president's spokesperson received very luxury tenders from the Gauteng Department of Health to produce PPE. And she had been a key witness in that matter, and that was one of the first examples where she faced backlash. Those she had investigated and those she had proffered evidence against fought back against her because they were her bosses. She was demoted, she was sent away from head office to go work from a Hillbrow outpost, and she was brought up on disciplinary charges, the most salient of which was not attending a meeting at 7 a.m. on Sunday. So she underwent that and faced disciplinary action on misconduct charges, and those misconduct charges ended up falling away when all of the leadership in that department were pushed out or fired on the back of SIU recommendations. And she returned to her post. And at the time, she articulated her views on corruption in that department in WhatsApp messages to Nishan Bolton. And she said the department is rotten. The only thing that changes is in that department when new people come in is that there's new actors coming in to loot. So that was the backdrop and the scene in which she found herself. And everything changed for her in August of 2021. On the 3rd of August, we know this because we've investigated this matter thoroughly, and we managed to get our hands on her cell phone and the 60,000 Gauteng Department of Health emails. So we know that on the 3rd of August, she authored a report titled Possibly Fraudulent Payments Out of Tembisa Hospital. And she sent that report to her boss, the CFO, who's now suspended, Lorato Maggio. And in that report, she sketched a dire picture of procurement fraud, what we now know as procurement fraud, but at the time she was highly suspicious of. What she'd found was that Tembisa Hospital, which is a tertiary facility and in no way comparable with the major hospitals or state hospitals in Gauteng, had pushed through 850 million rands worth of contracts in the space of 4 months. They did this through 1,203 individual purchase orders. And what had piqued Babita's interest was the fact that these purchase orders were all just under 500,000 rand, 499,500, 488,000, all of those figures were up there, and 500,000 rand turns out to be the cap of the delegation of authority for a hospital CEO. So it was clear that something was happening at that facility. To put it in perspective, Tembisa Hospital processed over 1,200 purchase orders. All the other hospitals combined were less than a third of that figure. So that's for one hospital. She raised her concerns and said, there's something wrong at Tembisa Hospital. We need an urgent forensic investigation, and she moved to stop the payments. Several days before she was killed, she sent a message to Maggio on WhatsApp, and she said, I'm worried that the Tembisa guys will know something, will know that we're onto something if they see we've stopped their payments. We need an urgent investigation. So she articulated that again. Ms. Maggio responded to her and said, I've escalated your concerns to the HOD for an investigation. That turned out to be a lie. Her concerns were never escalated. And what happened 4 days later? She was shot outside her house as she was driving into her driveway. So we know that she had found significant issues there, and we used that as a lodestar for our investigation. And what we found was rampant syndicate activity. We found collections of politically connected individuals who made in excess of R1 billion from Tembisa Hospital in the space of 2 years. And what I'm just trying to think of a vivid example, but there's so many. Some of the purchase orders related to buying 500,000 rands worth of children's skinny jeans, ages 6 to 7. Another was a 500,000 rand purchase of leather bonded wingback chairs, and that's something you'd see in a cigar lounge and not a hospital. Another one was 10,000 rand for a plastic bucket. And all of these contracts were steered to politically connected individuals, specifically Selo Sokoko, who's the Ekurhuleni ANC Treasurer General, and also to a man by the name of Hangwani Maumela, who is nephew to President Cyril Ramaphosa from a previous marriage. So what we found was an incredible extraction network across several hundred companies that had operated in some cases for many years before they were found out. And Babita's findings on, or in her report that she bumped up the chain of command, which turned out to be futile, was the first shades of that. What we took away from what we found in our investigation was that despite rigorous procurement prescripts and all the rules in terms of purchasing or state purchasing, all of that amounted to naught when the entire system was captured. When we talk about these hospital contracts, they originated at Tembisa Hospital. They originated with one person calling for these resources to be purchased. These grossly inflated purchases were approved by as many as 6 people on a bid adjudication committee. They were then rubber stamped again by the hospital CEO. And further up the line, this massive spike in spending was ignored by the Gauteng Department of Health leadership. And that is an indictment on them and their probity. So what we found was that we can have all the legislation, all the procurement prescripts available, but if they are not applied by honest individuals, all of these safeguards amount to nothing. And that's exactly what happened in Babita Deokaran's case. When we started writing about the story, we obviously put the screws to the Gauteng Department of Health and asked them what they had done to protect Babita Deokaran, firstly, and what they had done to investigate her concerns. We then found out that she was offered or afforded no protection. We found out that her concerns were never investigated fully. The forensic investigation that she called for never materialized. Instead, they ordered a random compliance audit of hospitals in the network. And that self-same audit had exactly the same findings as Babita Deokaran's report, and no investigation followed. So, why I said Babita's title as a whistleblower is contested is, I think back to a discussion I had with an official at the Department of Justice who told me that she is in no way a whistleblower. In terms of the relevant legislation as we sit today, she was an accountant. She was not a whistleblower. But she paid the ultimate price for being a whistleblower, even if the state apparatus is unwilling to call her that. So intent was the leadership of the Gauteng Department of Health at the time to ignore her findings. When they were asked questions in legislature about what they had done, the response was that Babita Deokaran had never formally escalated her concerns, despite there being a report that was sent to the Gauteng Department of Health leadership, and we've got the receipts, we have the emails. So what is urgently required is legislative reform, and we know that the wheels on this are turning slowly. My point that I'd like to make is that how many Babita Deokarans will we see whilst we prevaricate on legislation in order to ensure them protection? Because what we will find is that people will die without it. In terms of what can be done to support and encourage whistleblowing, legislation has to be there to protect them. Legislation has to be brought about urgently. As we sit here, whistleblowers are offered very little protection by the state, so they turn to civil society. So what must be done is now to support civil society. A classic example is Whistleblower House, who trudges along with an immense budgetary deficit and cannot support the whistleblowers that come to them. And it must be remembered that Whistleblower House is often the point of last resort. So these people are left out in the cold with very little. My last parting shot on how do we protect and encourage whistleblowers. We should negate the need for whistleblowers. The public service should be professionalized and filled with honest, capable individuals, because without corruption, there will be no need for whistleblowers.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you so much for keeping to time as well. Those are some very sobering thoughts that we will reflect on, and especially when we go into the questions section. I'd now like to hand over to Prof. Rahana Kasim to take the discussion forward.
Thank you very much, Cherise. Please confirm if you are able to see my slides.
Yes, we're able to see.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be given the opportunity to speak to you today on the topic of whistleblowing. Just to give you some background, as I'm sure you all know, you've discussed extensively already, but for those who don't, in 2022, the Zondo Commission made recommendations relating to the regulation of whistleblowing in South Africa. And in October last year, President Ramaphosa released his response to these recommendations. In June this year, the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development released for public comment a discussion document on proposed reforms for the whistleblower protection regime in South Africa. This discussion document was released in response to the whistleblower recommendation of the Zondo Commission reports. And the focus of this talk is whether the discussion document fully addresses the recommendation of the Zondo Commission. It's important to note that there are two main pieces of legislation which regulate whistleblowing. The one is the Protected Disclosures Act, and the other is the Companies Act. The whistleblower provisions in the Companies Act apply concurrently with those in the Protected Disclosures Act. And where those provisions in the Companies Act are inconsistent with those in the Protected Disclosures Act in conflict, both of them will actually apply at the same time if this is possible without contravening the other. Insofar as it's not possible, the Companies Act prevails. So the dominant statute is therefore the Companies Act. But you can see from this that employees in corporate environments have to refer to both statutes when disclosing any wrongdoing. And this is a challenging task given the different requirements for disclosure to qualify for protection. But adding to this complexity is that in addition to the Protected Disclosures Act and the Companies Act, there are at least 9 other statutes regulating whistleblowing, some of which protect individuals in the context of whistleblowing, others which encourage whistleblowing or oblige persons in positions of authority to report wrongdoing. These statutes include the Labor Relations Act, the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act, the Financial Intelligence Center Act, the National Environmental Management Act, the Pension Fund Act, and the Public Finance Management Act, just to mention a few. And this dispersed whistleblowing regulation presents a confusing web for whistleblowers to navigate and provides inconsistent protection. The complexity and vagueness, in my view, may also discourage persons from disclosing wrongdoing in their environment because of the uncertainty and inconsistency in the protection that these regulations offer. The discussion document has confined its whistleblower recommendation to enhancing solely the Protected Disclosures Act and widening the protection of this act to include persons that are not in an employer-employee relationship. While this recommendation may broaden the scope of the Protected Disclosures Act, in my view, it does not go far enough. It does not resolve the problem of whistleblowers having to navigate a confusing web of dispersed legislation, nor the problem of inconsistent protection provided for whistleblowers in the various statutes. In my view, the South African legislature must enact a consolidated and uniform legislative framework governing whistleblowing. This would entail creating one statute governing whistleblowing in the various sectors. It would also mean that the requirement to be satisfied before whistleblowers would be protected will be the same in the different sectors. This approach would bring clarity and ensure consistent protection for whistleblowers across multiple sectors. It will also make the laws regarding whistleblowing easy to understand and to rely on. The repercussions for whistleblowers in South Africa have been severe. It's clear from the reports of whistleblowers who have suffered physical harm, intimidation, loss of jobs, and even loss of career prospects. Some whistleblowers have even been murdered, as we've just heard in detail from Jeff Wicks about Babita Deokaran. And others have fled the country, such as Ethel Williams, fearing for their lives or safety. As the Zondo Commission report notes, recent events in South Africa make it the highest priority that a genuine whistleblower who reports wrongdoing should urgently receive effective protection against retaliation. The Zondo Commission recommended that whistleblowers should receive the protections afforded by Article 32.2 of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. The President's response agrees with this recommendation. Note that Article 32.2 is not strictly about whistleblowers, but provides for protecting witnesses, experts, and victims who testify about corruption. Signatory states, of which South Africa is one since 2004, must establish procedures for protecting witnesses, experts, and victims. So what does the discussion document recommend in this regard? First, it recommends that the Protected Disclosures Act should permit whistleblowers to request state protection if they have reasonable cause to believe that their life and that of their family are in danger because of the disclosure. Note, it requires the whistleblower to ask for it, and they must show they have reasonable cause to believe that they are in danger. It also suggests that whistleblowers should be included in the definition of a witness under the Witness Protection Act. Another recommendation is that persons who victimize whistleblowers under the auspices of the Protected Disclosures Act should be liable on conviction to a fine not exceeding 5 million rand or to imprisonment for up to 5 years or to both the fine and imprisonment. This is a laudable recommendation, but it is confined to the Protected Disclosures Act. So if a disclosure is made under the auspices of another statute regulating whistleblowing, such as the Companies Act, and a whistleblower is victimized, the proposed penalty will not apply. And this is another reason why I think that the discussion document is too narrow in focusing only on amending the Protected Disclosures Act, and why South Africa must have a consolidated legislative framework governing whistleblowing across all sectors. The discussion document also recommends that measures should be introduced under the Protected Disclosures Act to keep a protected disclosure confidential where information might identify the whistleblower, save in certain circumstances, such as where it's essential to release the information to investigate the disclosure effectively. While this is again a commendable suggestion, I think it's also important to protect the identity of whistleblowers in court proceedings. Whistleblowers should not be required to disclose their identity to a court or tribunal, or to disclose any information that is likely to lead to their identification. They should also be allowed to testify using communications technology, such as video conference. The second recommendation of the Zondo Commission is that whistleblowers should receive a percentage of the proceeds recovered on the strength of information they disclose. The President's response also suggested that whistleblowers should be rewarded a proportion of funds recovered, provided the information disclosed by them was material to recovering the funds. But disappointingly, the discussion document has not followed through on this recommendation. Instead, it recommends that a fund should be created to assist whistleblowers who have been dismissed and who face severe financial hardship in meeting their basic needs. While the fund may provide some relief to unemployed whistleblowers, in my view, this fund does not go far enough to incentivize whistleblowers in South Africa to come forward. Admittedly, it is controversial whether whistleblowers should be rewarded financially for their disclosures. On the one hand, financial awards may encourage whistleblowers to speak up about corruption and disclose high-quality information that would otherwise be difficult to obtain. An award system may also motivate companies to improve their internal whistleblowing systems and to deal more proactively with illegal behavior. And these awards would also reduce the financial risk faced by whistleblowers by offsetting costs that they incur in making the disclosure of wrongdoing and compensating them if they were to lose their job. But on the other hand, financial awards for whistleblowing raise moral and ethical concern, as well as concerns that whistleblowers would be motivated by gain rather than a desire to help expose wrongdoing. A counter-argument, in my view, is that in an environment where the level of corruption is so high, such as South Africa, the need to expose corruption should trump concerns about the ethical motives of whistleblowers. Another argument against financially rewarding whistleblowers is the awards may encourage fraudulent and malicious reporting and false allegations. To overcome this concern, I think that the legislative framework could explicitly discourage whistleblowers from such misconduct. And in any event, fraudulent reporting is a criminal offense which exposes a whistleblower to perjury charges. Given the high level of corruption, in my view, the benefits of a whistleblower award system in South Africa outweigh the possible misgivings about it. According to Transparency International, although rewards help to restore a whistleblower situation, their main aim is to incentivize whistleblowers to come forward. As reporting rates of wrongdoing in South Africa are low, whistleblowers urgently need to be encouraged to come forward with high-quality information to curb corruption, and a whistleblower award system would provide the necessary incentive for them to do so. So how should this award system look? I don't have too much time, but just to give a broad overview, as experience in the USA shows, where whistleblower reward programs have been successfully used, they can be very effective in encouraging whistleblowers to expose wrongdoing. A reward system for whistleblowers must be designed in accordance with best practices, especially for South Africa, because if it is poorly designed and implemented, its administrative costs may be excessive and unfeasible. For South Africa's whistleblower award program to succeed, there must be fairness, transparency, and efficiency in assessing potential awards to whistleblowers. In my view, private individuals should be empowered to enforce an action on behalf of the state. Such an action is known as a key term approach. And the advantages of the key term approach are that it draws out information which is difficult and costly to access and covers for gaps in investigative capacity, but at the same time incentivizing whistleblowers to make disclosures. But the Zondo Commission and the President's response opposed the introduction of the key term approach because of potential complications that may arise when private individuals are empowered to litigate for financial reward in the state's name. They recommend that a fixed percentage of monies recovered from the disclosure should be awarded to whistleblowers, provided that the information was material to obtaining the award. Although this approach is simpler than the key term approach, its disadvantage is that it is in the discretion of the relevant agency whether to pursue the matter. And should it decide not to pursue the matter, the whistleblower would have no option to proceed with an independent enforcement action. The Zondo Commission and President's response suggests that whistleblowers should be rewarded only when money is recovered from the disclosure. In my view, contrary to this approach, amid South Africa's high corruption rate and low reporting rate of wrongdoing, South Africa's whistleblower award program should provide for whistleblowers to be rewarded for information, even if it leads to no financial recovery, but results in at least in a successful criminal prosecution or successful resolution of the matter. Awards should also be given to whistleblowers, in my view, if the disclosure prevents financial loss to institution or benefits the public interest. This approach may result in a higher reporting rate of wrongdoing. And since the size of the award is intended to serve as a motivating factor for whistleblowers to disclose wrongdoing, it should be neither too low nor trivial. Safeguards must be incorporated into the South African whistleblower program to protect against malicious reporting and false allegations by whistleblowers. South Africa should also have an independent and dedicated body authorized to conclude agreements with whistleblowers to reward their disclosures. This will ensure that the program is properly executed and will minimize delays in finalizing claims from whistleblowers. The final whistleblower recommendation of the Zondo Commission is that whistleblowers should receive immunity from criminal or civil proceedings if they made an honest disclosure of information that might otherwise render them liable to prosecution or litigation. The President's response agrees with this recommendation. The discussion document does not appear to make clear recommendation relating to the immunity of whistleblowers. Currently, whistleblowers receive civil and criminal immunity under the Protected Disclosures Act and the Companies Act for making a disclosure, but the immunity does not extend to their liability for participating in the wrongdoing that is disclosed. Although immunity to whistleblowers would encourage them to disclose information, in my view, they should not be granted blanket immunity, as this could result in abuse by whistleblowers who are involved in the wrongdoing or even planned and initiated the wrongdoing, who then decide to disclose it to avoid being criminally prosecuted or held civilly liable. I think that a whistleblower's immunity should be determined on a case-by-case basis. Where appropriate, the repercussions for the crime or civil liability should be mitigated or exempted. In conclusion, the discussion document has some commendable suggestions, but I do not think that it goes far enough in addressing the recommendations of the Zondo Commission or in encouraging and incentivizing whistleblowers. This is concerning because without adequate incentives, whistleblowers would hesitate to come forward. Given the alarming levels of corruption in South Africa, it is imperative that whistleblowers are incentivized to step forward. These proposals in the discussion document will require further development before being drafted into an amendment bill. It is hoped that once they are finalized and implemented, they will go further in protecting and rewarding whistleblowers. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Kassim. I think we've had very interesting inputs here with Jeff setting the scene for a particular circumstance that we know quite a lot about, Babita Deokran's story, and then Prof. Kassim outlining, what has been done in the past year in relation to the Department of Justice's discussion document, and also very helpfully comparing that to the Zondo recommendations as well as the President's responses. So I think we've got good groundwork here for a very kind of stimulating discussion. I think I can kick off with a question or two of my own, and then I'll ask my questions, and then we'll take maybe 2 from the audience and 1 online. My question to the panelists is that when we are talking about legislative intervention or legislative change as a means to address whistleblowing problems, we kind of come up with this issue that is quite a long-term approach. Even this discussion document was quite long awaited, and moreover, you don't want to rush any legislative intervention. Then, after the law is passed, then it's regulations, and then there's, it takes time for people to actually come to grips with the legislation. Sometimes it goes then to court, and, it's going to be many, many years before these interventions in terms of the amendment of the legislative regime actually result in tangible change. So the question is there something that we can do in parallel for a more short-term benefit beyond kind of looking at, and I think even if you were to, if you're going to structure incentive system, that's also going to have to be in terms of the law. And so, barring those types of interventions, what can we do to address some of the short-term issues that whistleblowers face? I think I will then maybe take a round of questions. We can see some. We'll take one in the front here. And 1, 2, 3. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm Wendy Orr from the Anti-Corruption Coalition, and as an apartheid-era whistleblower back in 1985, there was obviously no legislation in place protecting me. But what sustained me was the support, kind of the emotional and social support that I received, largely from within the profession, but also from the anti-apartheid movement. People reached out to me and said, do you need a new job? Do you need to get out of the country? Are you feeling safe? What can we do to support you? So although I was being ostracized from the people in the district surgeon's office and the Department of Health, I was embraced by like-minded people. And that made the world of difference. I know we can't legislate for emotional and social support, but I guess this follows on your question as well, is what can we do to provide that kind of support for whistleblowers? I've spoken to some of the SARS whistleblowers, and for them, the ostracization, the marginalization, the being almost seen as pariahs, that damage was almost as bad as threats to their physical security and the financial impact.
Thanks for those insights, Wendy. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. I'm Christine Hobden from the Wits School of Governance, and I teach public service ethics there, so this is also the context to my question. I wanted to ask about the definition of the whistleblower. Jeff, I thought it was really interesting you brought up that point. And I guess I was wondering, we can look at that as just a semantic question, and people can also use it to discredit, which is certainly not the direction I'm going in. But I do wonder if we need more kind of categories or definitions to really capture the different things that were going on between whistleblowing, internal reporting, kind of just doing your job and hitting a wall that ended up in kind of raising a flag, in order to fully protect everybody and to think long term about the legislation. Because I think right now we're in a position where all three of those things kind of came about with the same result. But if we're trying to think about who are we incentivizing, who needs to be protected, do we need more, like granular definitions? And I say this also, I mentioned the teaching because I think when I talk to public servants in my context, it's very murky. And they see any kind of reporting as whistleblowing sometimes, but also whistleblowing is only things moral heroes do, that comes at extremely high costs. So trying to think through that with them is very difficult, and I wonder what the panelists think about trying to get, not just as the philosopher, but as the practical going forward, do we need clearer definitions of the different categories?
Thank you, Christine. In the back, there we go.
Hi, I'm Fatima from the Ethics Institute. I just wanted to share a little bit about the work that we're doing as part of input into the conversation. So we do the South African Business Ethics Survey, and in the survey it quite clearly shows the correlation between the culture of an organization and reporting. So in a poor ethical culture, there's more observation around unethical conduct but less reporting. And in a strong ethical culture, you find lower observances of unethical conduct but higher instances of reporting. And a lot of that goes to trust. So a lot of our public sector organizations have whistleblowing mechanisms in place. We've got the hotlines, but the problem really sits in the trust. And if we look at the public sector ethics survey, which we've done over three iterations, you're actually seeing a decline in the trust that public servants have in the mechanisms that are available for reporting. And when you ask them, why don't you want to report? It's about fear of victimization, it's about fear for safety, and it's about the fact that I don't trust that anything will be done about it. And so when we talk practically outside of the legislative solutions, we also need to talk practically about the culture that we create in our organizations to be conducive towards whistleblowing. So we have fantastic policies and we have fantastic mechanisms in place, but the levels of trust in these mechanisms are low. And so it's also about the leadership commitment, it's about the safety mechanisms. I mean, just listening to Jeff's narrative today, it's about saying what, and integrity is a lot about, if we say we're going to do something, we must do what we say we're going to do. And practically, it's also about having that conversation and getting people to, because it's fine. And Cynthia is here today. I mean, she can tell a story also. But it's also about recognizing that it's not easy to blow the whistle. And there's tremendous cost involved, and it's not a financial cost only. And what does that actually look like? So having those conversations, getting people to appreciate what does it mean to blow the whistle? Because if we look at our language, we've shifted from anti-corruption to integrity management. And integrity management is a lot about proactive and reactive. And reactive is about saying, we'll put mechanisms in place to detect, but as employers, we may miss something. So we rely on our employees to understand that if they say something, it builds our culture. But if they don't appreciate that context, then having a fantastic hotline in place that we pay an external service provider for is not going to be utilized. I think maybe just to throw some of that practicality into the conversation.
Thank you, Fatima. Devi, I did also want to take an online question, if you could read one for us as well.
Sure. There's a quick comment from Karen Bota, who says whistleblowers need to include those who resign before they blow the whistle. And then a question from Tembekile Makubele. He says, do we have a reliable system for whistleblowers to report securely about corruption? With hotlines mushrooming and the country not in a position to even tell how many cases have been generated from all the hotlines in the country, you know, there's more than one can count in terms of hotlines, many of which are easily accessible by the powers that be who can access the information that goes through those hotlines. So do we have a secure system at all?
Thanks. David, maybe or do you want to respond directly to that? Okay, so maybe for the next round. Yes, no, definitely with the hotlines, that's a huge question, and Fatima has also kind of raised it within the private sector and with the public sector as well. What you see is that there's a proliferation of hotlines in places that you can report, like the Public Protector, Public Service Commission hotline, but there's no kind of back-end coordination to kind of, you know, in a systematic way, direct people towards the body that's most appropriate to deal with the complaint. So that sometimes ends up, you know, quite difficult as well. And what we've heard is that sometimes through those hotlines, the official hotlines, it gets reported to the kind of higher up in the department, and that person is often the person that is implicated in the wrongdoing. So it sometimes goes directly back to the person that is being reported, and the consequences of that are massive. So I would definitely agree that hotlines are a problem. That needs kind of a kind of dedicated focus. I think both, and I think that applies equally to the business model of these of the private sector hotlines, where people pay for a service. Same thing happens. It's no insulation. Then I think we can hand over to maybe Rahana. You can answer the questions that you've heard from. You can select whichever questions you'd like to respond to, and then Jeff, we can go to you. Rahana?
Thank you, Cherise. I'll run through the questions, give my answers, and Jeff can then give his point of view as well. On the first question about, it's a very good point that it takes a long time for the legislation to come into force and for everyone to come to grip with it. What do we do now? And as we can see, the discussion document, I don't think it's up to scratch, and I think much more work needs to be done. So one thing for me to do very urgently is physical protection of whistleblowers. You know, it's simply just incomprehensible that a whistleblower would be assassinated and shot 12 times outside her home. You know, we can't have that sort of thing. And it really does terrify people to actually blow the whistle. And some people, you want to do the right thing. I think all of us have this inner sense of justice. We want to do that, but we're too afraid. And for me, I think that if the Witness Protection Act could be amended to include whistleblowers in that category of witnesses, because currently they don't fit in there, that would help to some extent to protect whistleblowers and provide some protection for them with regard to physical protection. And it should extend even as far as their families. Having said that, I do think it's very sad that we need to go to these measures, you know, to relocate whistleblowers if necessary, just because you have blown the whistle. But for me, that is something that I think could be done quite urgently, and it means amending the Witness Protection Act, not drafting new whistleblower legislation. So hopefully that could be done fairly soon. To answer the question also on a definition of whistleblower, I think Jeff Briggs will respond to this as well. It was directed to him and was his point. We don't have a definition of whistleblower as such, but if you look at the legislation, I'm looking at the Companies Act and the Protected Disclosures Act. It says, for example, in the Companies Act, if a shareholder, a director, an employee, company secretary, and other persons who fall in the category of corporate whistleblowers disclose information relating to some or other wrongdoing by a director of the company. And the categories are very broad. The wrongdoing can relate to the company breaching a statute or some sort of discrimination, and it's got certain categories. If you do all of those things, you will get the certain protections in the Companies Act. So to me, that makes you a whistleblower immediately if you fall into the relevant category, such as an employee or a shareholder, company secretary, and you disclose wrongdoing under the said category, such as the director breaching the Companies Act or any other relevant statute to which the act applies to a company, you will be protected. And that should immediately qualify you as a whistleblower. So I also find it difficult to understand why Babita would be accused of not being a whistleblower, because if she had done that, met those basic criteria, she would be. I think Andre de Ruyter is another one who's been accused of not being a whistleblower for various reasons. But the way I look at it, if you disclose some wrongdoing, which a company, being a state-owned entity, was involved in, that immediately makes him a whistleblower. And I'd be hesitant to have a definition of a whistleblower that is too narrow, because then what would happen, everybody would try to argue you don't fit into it just to avoid giving you protection. But I think already our legislation is wide enough to include people as whistleblowers without, really being able to raise the argument that a person is not a whistleblower. Also, to make the point about, I agree that it's not only a financial cost to whistleblowing, there's all sorts of other personal repercussions. I mean, you lose your job, but apart from that, you ostracize, as we just heard. You also, people go through depression, they suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, mental health issues, and so on. Also why I think it's very important to protect whistleblowers, but more than that, the mindset needs to change. Whistleblowers are often seen as traitors. We don't see them for the courageous people they are, who are actually rendering a service to society. We see them as traitors. And as soon as a person's a whistleblower, we ostracize them, which is wrong. We should regard them as heroes, and protect them and not put them through all sorts of accusations or question whether they have motives and so on. And I think the mindset in South Africa needs to change. And I think part of the mindset is because in the apartheid days, whistleblowers were, associated with what were known as impimpies, apartheid era spies. And I think that's the first thing that needs to change in this country. They're not traitors, they're actually heroes. We need to respect that. And finally, just to answer the question about the hotlines, all companies under the company, well, public companies and state-owned companies under the Companies Act are required to have internal systems where employees can report whistleblowing. But many companies do not have this, or they have inefficient systems, which is why many whistleblowers will go outside hotlines or external parties or the media and report wrongdoing. And companies frown on this because they regard it as the whistleblower being disloyal. And I think one thing that needs to be done, and it actually needs to be enforced quite strongly, is to ensure that all companies at the very outset do have internal compliance systems which do work and which are efficient. So this, and also which will protect the identity of whistleblowers. Once we do that, maybe we won't have a need for so many external hotlines, and that people can deal with it inside the company at the outset. And the other problem is that often there's just no enforcement. If you do report a complaint of some sort, it doesn't always get escalated to the right person. It should nothing ever happen. It can sit there for a year or two and nothing will really happen. And that's also why internal compliance systems need to be quite strict with how much time a person has, the company has to respond to the complaint. The discussion document does make some recommendations regarding this, and does give companies a certain period in which to respond. So hopefully some of those recommendations on the internal systems and hotlines will come into force. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Kassim. Jeff?
Yes, thanks. I think if I can distill your question and Wendy's question into what do we do now? What do we do in the intervening time? I think it's a critical thing to examine. And I think what the Prof has had to say, and I think the general landscape tells us that, legislative change is required. It's required to clear up the murk around whistleblowers, but we know that this is a lengthy process. So what happens in the intervening time? And it goes back to what I said initially when I spoke, was that the status quo at present means that whistleblowers are completely ostracized. They face becoming pariahs in their communities, they lose their jobs, they become destitute, they face criminal charges, they face internal disciplinary charges, and they need a wide array of support across many different spheres. And that's where an organization like Whistleblower House becomes pivotally important, because they don't only provide physical protection, legal assistance, psychological counseling, and other services, but they are literally the only people who will do it. And, whistleblowers, as we've said, they face immense persecution. And, in my case study, the whistleblower was killed. But for those who have to live with the consequences of doing the right thing, people like Cynthia and people like Johan van Lochenberg, who face losing their jobs and losing their livelihoods, it's it's a bitter pill for them to swallow, and they need someone to assist them, and the only place that they can turn, in actuality, is civil society. I think Fatima's point about trust within an organization is key. And, from reading Babita Deocran's emails, we could see that when she first picked up on the spend, she went to other people in the department to just confirm that her suspicions were on the right track. And we saw these emails, and in the early stage of pursuing the story, I contacted a woman who Babita had confided in. And she said to me, everyone knows that this is happening. And I fully support what you're doing, but I can't talk to you because I'll end up like Babita. So that is the culture that exists in one government department, and I'm convinced that it's replicated elsewhere. Going back to the point about a financial reward, what good is money when you're dead? And what good is that money when you face the threat of death consistently all the way up until the point money is maybe recovered? I think, in summation to this round of questioning, what is required is accountability. And this doesn't only apply to whistleblowers, but it applies across, or transcends rather, many arms of what's spoken about at this conference. It's accountability, because what Babita Deocran's case is, it's a cautionary tale. And the true damage of a lack of accountability in this matter is impossible to measure, because how many people will now see what a whistleblower was subjected to, paying the ultimate price and being murdered, and having no one brought to book? We have 6 trigger men who are now in jail. We still do not know where the mastermind is. That police investigation has now gone cold. Any of the implicated officials who face disciplinary action now, that's still in progress 2.5 years later. So there is a distinct lack of accountability. And there, at this stage, is very little cause for whistleblowers to place their lives in danger, knowing that it's the right thing, but you will die because of it. I asked a question to Babita Deocran's daughter. Do you think your mother's a hero, or do you think her sacrifice will inspire others? And you might put her answer down to just teenage naivety, but she was saying, no, people aren't going to want to come forward, and people shouldn't, because what happens is you lose a mother. And I think that's what it boils down to.
Sure. Thank you, Jeff. Those are some heavy thoughts. Okay, so I think we can go to, we'll take 2 questions. So David and then Riyadh. Then, and then also, I also wanted to acknowledge before we go on that, we're very fortunate to have whistleblowers in the room with us. And so I did want to give an opportunity. Thank you, Wendy. You and I haven't met, but there's other whistleblowers here like June and Cynthia, and I'd also like to give an opportunity for both of you to make any contributions and inputs that you'd like to make. So if we can start with David.
Jeff, you said that when the the protective clothing scandal broke out, there were a whole bunch of people fired from the Department of Health, I guess, and you said that they were immediately replaced by people equally crooked. Why was that? Why were they not replaced by 6 Babita Deocarabs? I ask that because it strikes me that this wasn't just a question of bad people or good people, but that the entire institution had been infected by corruption. It was a case of what Feroz earlier referred to as institutional corruption or systemic corruption. And the other thing that I wanted to ask is, how does one distinguish between Cynthia Stimple on the one hand and an Agreasy on the other hand? These are both whistleblowers. The one in order to save his own skin, the other in order to do the right thing. And from the perspective of giving support and protection and the like, how do you make a distinction between those two? And then to say that there's a third class of whistleblower, somebody who takes time to blow the whistle. So there was a case like this in Eskom, very senior employee in in Eskom, who was the only woman in a executive suite of all men, all of whom had worked together for a very long time, a tough and intimidating bunch. She took a year or two to blow the whistle. No financial gain for her in not blowing the whistle, but just fear of the consequences and uncertainty about the extent of the whistleblowing, or whether this was corruption, or whether it was just the way things were practiced. She was treated very badly by the Eskom board. She was also treated very badly by the Zondo Commission, I thought. How do you extend your empathy to whistleblowers and your acknowledgement of the dangers of them, to them, of people who just take their time longer than you think, longer than the public thinks they should have taken to blow the whistle?
Thanks, David, for those interesting questions. Riyadh?
I thought that was fascinating, that last question, because there is a there is a duality there with whistleblowers, many of them, whether we like it or not. I think the infamous drive that the Zondo Commission in many ways was based on is one point that we have to keep in mind. In those two whistleblowers whisked out of the country, supported while they're outside of the country for a couple of years at a huge cost to a private donor. And that brings into focus, I think, the need for our own witness safety programs. And I want to know, what is the consensus around from the room, really, around the whistleblower agency, whether we should be having one or not. And I think that just to turn the focus a bit inwards on filmmakers and journalists, I mean, we interviewed Philemon Ngwenya from the Freda dairy farm, a small-scale farmer. And at that time, I wasn't really that aware or alike to the issue of our responsibility. Okay, he got killed before the film came out. We're not absolutely sure whether his murder was related to the scandal there, but certainly it comes back down to the duty of care and a code of conduct and some principles we need to develop around reporting on people who we possibly can put in harm's way. And is that work being done anywhere, Jeff? And if so, where? And then finally, I think you need to blow your own whistle a bit more. Jeff, you've produced a fantastic film. Certainly I was able to see it courtesy of Defend Our Democracy, which we need to get out there and use, because it's certainly a very persuasive argument and case you're putting forward, and you're pointing fingers in very clear directions. I noticed you were a lot more careful today in your presentation than you are in your film. So thanks again, Jeff.
Thank you. If June and Cynthia, if you can each have 5 minutes to make your remarks or ask questions, and then 5 minutes for each of the panelists to respond. Thanks.
Thank you. I come to these events because this is where I fuel myself. I do protest posters outside Samsung in Bryanston. And when I introduce myself, I always say I am June Bellamy. I am a Samsung whistleblower, because we have no voice. But I come here because I've been in the space for 6 years now. And I must say, very pleasingly, over the last 2 days, there are certain things that seem to be turning, and then other areas where I think we're going off on a tangent and won't necessarily be beneficial for the whistleblower. But in the context of this, what I wanted to point out is one or two things. So the question is, how do you define that whistleblower? Johan from Lochenberg has shared with me his PowerPoint presentation that he's done, and I took it, expanded on a little bit, but he breaks it down beautifully. But the fact that we're not talking about it worries me, that the judiciary doesn't have it, or do they have it and they haven't seen it and they're ignoring it? And I've also submitted myself, because one of the things which is very clear that can be utilized, that does not make a whistleblower, is time. How quickly do you whistleblow? How quickly don't you whistleblow? And I myself fall into, there's actually 4 categories that we've come up with, not 3. And I fall into all of those categories because you don't always come up with the evidence you need very quickly. You do have to stay in there. What is your family situation? You've got your job, you've got your kids. So there's a lot of factors that the judiciary is not looking into and others aren't looking into, but time is a very clear factor and motivator. And that's why we say Agreetsi is not a whistleblower. He is a person who's turned state's witness. And for myself, that title should be removed from him. The other thing that I'd like to really press home here is something that was brought up yesterday, and that is getting rid of the rot at the top. And I've been testing this as well. The director I whistleblew against signed an NDA and is now in Philips. Another director is now in MTN. We have to stop the movement of unethical persons moving between businesses, state-owned enterprises. And you were talking yesterday about a register. We've raised this before. So I'm very pleased to hear that that is being raised and brought up. We need to have, that's why I always say, with Cynthia Nauta's case, with the delinquent director of Dudu Mayeni, you need to have those, you need to have that list. Because when I went to the CCMA, immediately you threatened with, you will become a poor performer, your ID will go onto the list, and you won't get another job. And I turned around and said, well, where's the companies list of poor companies that aren't protecting their whistleblowers? And there isn't one. So we definitely have to please get that into place. And I must just thank as well, Jeff Wicks. I very much appreciated everything that you've done, and the other journalists. And I would just very quickly like to invite Professor Kasim to contact me. I'm on LinkedIn. You'll find me there. I'd very much like to have a conversation with you. Thank you.
Thank you, June. Cynthia?
Thank you very much. I want to just talk about, I'll start with the definition. Yes, the PDA does not state the definition clearly. And in the Witness Protection Act, there's no whistleblower mentioned either. And so with the discussion document, it's one of the key things that must come out, that there must be a broad definition. So Whistleblower House has come up with a very simple definition stating a person who reported wrongdoing in an organization to someone who believe that they will take action. And this is where Babita comes in. While the DOJ feels that she didn't report it, she didn't make a formal disclosure, the mere fact that she did a report and put it to her senior, believing that a senior will do something about it, makes a whistleblower. And so there shouldn't be a debate about it. I'm not going to go about the range of whistleblowers. I think we've discussed that enough. Just what solutions can we have right now that can easily work? One is that there has to be stop reprisals against whistleblowers. Harassment needs to stop. Ostracization needs to stop. That's every organization, the CEO's executive board needs to stop that. Once they get a report or disclosure, it must be investigated and based on facts. If there's no evidence, no facts to prove what they're saying, they can't take it forward. The whistleblower or the discloser or the person saying it should not be touched. And that doesn't need legislation. It can easily come into internal procedures in organizations, and that can be solved very quickly. Every organization can do that. Again, these issues must be investigated, whether you do your internal audit doing it or you get a forensic investigator to get the facts. And then I just want to talk about, and that if the whistleblower is not touched, they're already protecting the whistleblower. The mere fact that the minute the whistleblower brings a case forward, they are the ones under investigation, they are the target, and they are the ones that are being ousted. It should not happen. So if we can start turning everything on the opposite, we'll start seeing the change working effectively. And then if I may talk about Whistleblower House, please. Just to let you know, there is a huge gap. We've seen it identified by Jeff Wicks and by Professor Rahana and everyone else who's experienced it, that we've got the Act, yes. We've got many other legislations that are linked to the PDA, yet organizations don't follow that. If anyone is disclosed, they immediately attack the person, and HR plays a key role in facilitating this. So just on HR, I feel HR plays a huge role to start being mediators here, stopping the people who follow direction from board or from executive to enact what they want. Get rid of this person, fire this person, suspend this person, and they don't play that mediator. They have a key role to start performing their role. Otherwise, they should not be human resources practitioners. What Whistleblower House has done, we've come into the space only because there's this huge gap in the market. And so the role we're playing at the moment is to have that whistleblower have access to legal assistance, because the first thing most whistleblowers that came out with Fatima is fear. You're not going to speak out because of fear. You're not going to speak out for fear of a loss of your job, your family, and how do I pay? I can't afford a lawyer. So here we're saying if you can do it safely, we'll find you the lawyer and you get the legal assistance, because everyone, there's not one person that can tell me they didn't go through trauma. We've provided legal counsel, clinical psychologist, or we're looking at other therapy for whistleblowers. The third thing we're providing is safety and security. And here, whistleblowers who find that they need safety where they're staying in their homes, we've provided an upgrade for their security. For others, we're currently partnering with an organization. It's about to launch, called Aura. We're just testing it with one whistleblower at the moment. If that works, every whistleblower will have that app on their phone, and if they just press that, an armed response will come to you immediately, whether at your vulnerable points when you're leaving your home or arriving. So that's just the little things that we're doing. And the last is providing financial support. It is small, it's not enough. It will never pay that home loan for that whistleblower. It will never pay their debt. It will never recoup help someone like Babita's daughter, who's now in matric, and how does she go forward for university fees, etc. It will never pay that, but it's something that puts food on the table. It allows people to at least keep their lights on and pay school fees for those kids that aren't in private schools. So those are the four things, and here I'm just advocating here's where business can come in and help and support these civil societies. We're not the only ones doing it. There's another organization called PLAF. Corruption Watch is in this space. Outa is in this space. Trying to think of others that support. So there's a big group of civil societies. And so if businesses, individuals can start supporting those and then closing the net of how do we help and protect that whistleblower, we will start seeing a change. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Panelists, I'll go to you for your 3-minute responses each, if you're able to kind of condense down. Let's start with Jeff.
Sure. I mean, to answer David's question, why were the rotten individuals not replaced with Babita Deocrans? It's sort of indicates the need to professionalize the public service. It has to start there. It has to start with appointing the right people who are capable of doing the job, whose probity is beyond reproach. And that's not what we've seen, especially in Babita Deocran's situation. She went from one set of managers who were either dismissed or jumped before they could be pushed by the SIU to a new set of managers who just perpetuated the situation. That is the genesis of the issue, or part of the genesis of the issue, that will go towards negating the need for whistleblowers. And then, how do we draw the line between a Babita Deocran and Angelo Agrizzi? Personally, I'm appalled that he uses the title of whistleblower. And I think fundamentally it comes down to motivation. He's an individual who profited extensively from malfeasance at Bosasa. And for all intents and purposes, Babita Deocran's only crime was raising the flag when she saw a spike in expenditure. They are not the same, and they cannot be considered the same. I firmly believe that. And to address your question, sir, of what journalists do to protect whistleblowers, hard one to answer. We have to fall back on our journalistic principles, and source protection is paramount. And I mean, it's something that we really didn't have to navigate in this investigation because our whistleblower had already paid the price. But that said, we have had other people coming to us afterwards, inspired by her sacrifice and saying, please, can you try and assist us? And, you know, what we say to them is that, of course, we will help you where we can, but fundamentally, we're journalists. We're not the police. We're not the National Prosecuting Authority. We're not the SIU. We have limited power in this situation, but the power we do have is to tell a story. And we take every step possible to do that responsibly and to do that in a way that doesn't compromise our sources' safety, because we know full well what's at stake. We know full well that this is a life and death game, because I've experienced that in pursuing the story. And you mentioned that I'm a bit more measured today than I was in the film. I've had to be measured for the past 18 months. I've not had a comfortable drive in the past 18 months, because the reality of this investigation is that we picked up where Babita Deocran left off, and we've created significant headaches for some very powerful people. So we're fully aware of the danger, not only faced by journalists, but faced by whistleblowers. And if I can say one last thing, it's whenever I talk about whistleblowers, I always think about Mandy Wiener's book, and she opens it with a quote from Muslim Motepu, who says that journalists win awards for their work, and whistleblowers are left with nothing. It's true. It's true. And we all collectively need to do more to protect and prop up these individuals who sacrifice so much.
Sure. Thank you, Jeff. Rehana, if you can have 3 minutes.
Thank you. I'll just be brief. I think the questions and the comments made today were very interesting hearing from those whistleblowers and their personal experiences, and also very commendable what we've heard from Whistleblower House and other representatives who are supporting whistleblowers in many ways, not just financially, also psychologically and in other ways. But I think what is at the same time very worrying is that we actually need these groups. You know, it shouldn't be the case that whistleblowers should be in this position where the only recourse is to go to civil society groups for protection. And I think at the very outset, first of all, I think the attitude needs to change in this country. You know, whistleblowers are not traitors. And I think internal compliance systems of companies really need to be improved so that whistleblowers are able to make reports without being ostracized. And many internal compliance systems actually don't make provision for whistleblowers to remain anonymous. A lot of the time they're told, if you remain anonymous, we can't actually investigate, and we need to get evidence from you to take it forward. And then that also puts a whistleblower at risk. I think compliance systems need to change. I think whistleblowers need to be allowed to remain anonymous, not be exposed in this way. And that is perhaps a step that can be done quite easily, as someone mentioned, without going through legislative change. As a first step, keep whistleblowers anonymous. So we don't need to be looking at whether they are going to be, assassinated or anything of that sort. But until then, I think, civil society groups are going to be necessary to protect the whistleblowers. But I do hope that we do reach a point quite soon in this country where we don't treat whistleblowers as traitors. And make them lose their jobs and that sort of thing. I think that whole thing, that's first of all, the mental attitude needs to change. And I think that will also go a long way in helping whistleblowers. Thank you.
Thank you, Rehana, and thank you to everyone, Jeff, Rehana, for your comments, and to all of you for your inputs into this very interesting discussion. It's clear that really a lot needs to be done fast and also over the long term to assist whistleblowers because the situation now is quite untenable. There's two things that I'd just like to mention in closing. Cynthia listed a couple of organizations working on this issue. I'm happy to say that there's a multi-stakeholder partnership called WHISPR. It's WSPR, which is these organizations coming together to kind of tackle in a kind of coordinated way issues relating to whistleblowing. Oh, it stands for Whistleblower Support Platform for Reform. Sorry, I needed to say that. And we're hoping that over time we'll be able to bring in, public sector and private sector actors as well, so that, there's a space where people can convene and try to address some of these issues as well. So I encourage you to look out for WHISPR communications and WHISPR events so that you can engage more on these issues, because I think that's the only way that we can really take it forward is if we do it together. And Jeff mentioned about investigators getting awards. Well, I'm happy to say that tonight, whistleblowers are going to be getting recognition. There's going to be a gala dinner celebrating whistleblowers and providing some awards to whistleblowers. It's organized by Public Interest SA. So we'll be heading off there a little bit later. So it's nice to see that there's kind of a broader acknowledgement of whistleblowers, and hopefully this will kind of, give people the indication and really send the message that whistleblowers are heroes and they deserve to be celebrated. So thank you very much for your time, and wish you all the best. Let's go to the next panel.